Hi, everyone. This is Kim Kennedy with Conversations on Culture. So glad that you're joining us. And today, I just want to take some time and introduce you to a guest speaker who I hope will be joining us many times in the future, Chris Wright with the Potomac Tea Party. And Chris is one of the most interesting conservatives I've met. He has a lot to say. He knows a lot of people and will bring really interesting content to us. So without further ado, I'm going to let Chris talk and share about himself.
Thanks, Kim. Greetings from the edge of the swamp. I'm an independent liberty activist. I travel in Tea Party circles, so I'm in the leadership of Potomac Tea Party, which is in suburban Washington, D.C. And we have gone national this year. We formed in 2009 as Alexandria Tea Party in Virginia. We've gone national this year to better promote the Tea Party core values to the nation. Those values are limited government under the Constitution, free markets, and fiscal responsibility. There's lots of Tea Parties doing lots of dynamic things, and many of them focus on issues and working Capitol Hill and working candidates and campaigns. We saw a niche that nobody else was filling, and that was promoting the core values. And so we've decided that that's what we're going to be about from this point forward. So to that end, we've made 4 videos so far. We've had a national conference call. We have articles on our website, which is at potomacteaparty.com. Now, in addition to that, I have a personal website, liberato.us, L-I-B as in boy, E-R-A-T as in Tom, O, liberato.us. And there I have a lot of information on there about the Constitution. I do a weekly roundup of Constitution news. I do a weekly commentary called Constitution Minute. And I also have a rapid response team. I call it Champions of the Champions of the Constitution Grassroots Network. And we push back whenever we see somebody attacking the Constitution or saying something stupid about it, like former Justice John Paul Stevens did earlier this year with respect to the Second Amendment in the New York Times, and I can talk more about that later. The other thing I do, in addition to the Tea Party and the Constitution activities, is that I have something I've started called the Anti-Communism Action Team. And there, the most important thing I'm doing there, and I consider it probably the best thing of all the things that I'm doing, excuse me, I have a speakers bureau. We have survivors of communism from Ukraine, Czechoslovakia, Belarus, Lithuania, Vietnam, and Cuba, and they share their personal stories about what life is really like under socialism, which young people desperately need to hear given the newfound popularity of socialism these days. And they have a very simple but very powerful message. They say Americans better wake up. We've been down the socialist road and we know what's at the end of it. So that's the Tea Party, the Constitution, and anti-communism. That's pretty much what I'm about.
Well, we're with you 150%, Chris. Listeners, subscribers, I want you to know that we're a website that is not just going to talk about things, but how to do things. And Chris, I know you're going to be very helpful to us in that. We look forward to speaking with you more in the future.
Thank you. So what I thought I'd do today is talk about where my starting point is with respect to the Constitution, and then get into some current news stories about the Constitution, because you always hear this from the left: the Constitution is irrelevant. I think by the end of today's show, you'll know that the Constitution is anything but irrelevant. And then finally, as Kim mentioned, we'll get into some action items pushing back on enemies of the Constitution. So with that as by way of introduction, let me get into my starting point, where I start with about the Constitution. I strongly believe that the rise of the authoritarian left is the central challenge of our time. We saw it with Obamacare, where they rammed that down our throats when they had a chance, and you see it now with Antifa in the streets, cracking heads, trying to shut people up and take away their First Amendment rights. So right behind the left are coming the Muslims who want to impose Sharia law on America. Now, I don't want to get deeply into that, But I do want to say that based after study and seeing many presentations on constitutional subjects related to Islam, I can say with certitude that Islam is completely incompatible with democracy, our Constitution, and in particular, our First Amendment right to free speech. So both the left and Islam are enemies of the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution's in their way. They want to get rid of it. Either that or they want to interpret it out of existence. They want, both of them in their own ways, they want to concentrate power into the hands of a tiny elite of people, whether you call them technocrats in Washington or mullahs in mosques. They want a small group of people to take over, take your freedom, and rule over you. Now, the classic question of political science of all time is how to prevent the concentration of power. So when you are ruled by a single person or a tiny elite, bad things happen. You see that in communism, you see it in the authoritarian left, and you see it wherever the mullahs rule over the people. Limited government, like we have here under our Constitution in the United States, limited government never killed 100 million people, but communism has. So the founders were all about preventing the concentration of power. This is why they put things in the Constitution like checks and balances, separation of powers, federalism. They divided power as many ways as they possibly could. So the Constitution, if faithfully observed, will prevent the concentration of power. The Constitution is what stands between you and a tiny group of people that wants to take over, whether it's the authoritarian left, Islam, or anyone else. My website, my personal website, is dedicated to keeping America a free country. Liberty and justice for all. That's what I want, and that's what the Constitution gives us.
Well, again, Chris, we are in agreement on what we're trying to do to achieve the same goals. And as you're speaking, one of the strong tenets of conversations on the culture is bringing people like yourself and the hundreds of thousands of other groups across the country who share those same ideals and coming together as one large lobbying group for limited government, a return to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and making an impact in DC. And in strength and in numbers, we can affect our culture. Right now, I think the left has an advantage over the right in their organizing and in how they impact the culture. I think they use a lot of devious means to do so, has been my observation. But I think if we can form coalitions on things that we agree with, instead of focusing on that which we don't agree with, we can push back and fight back to preserve liberty. Your thoughts on that?
Well, one thought I'm having is that you called me a conservative at the beginning of the show, and there's something called a full spectrum conservative, which is on defense, on fiscal matters, on social questions. I may not be a full spectrum conservative. I run in libertarian circles somewhat, but I am definitely a constitutional conservative. That's one of the 6 parts of being a full spectrum conservative. I strongly believe that we can't do any better than the founders did, the framers did, in setting up our Constitution. It's just it can be amended, and the means for amending it are right there in the Constitution. So it does accommodate social change and technological change, but I strongly believe we can't do any better. Now, you mentioned the culture, and I also believe that politics is downstream from culture, and I have a friend in mind specifically. He's very into the idea that unless we take steps to take back the culture, we don't have a prayer in recapturing the ascendancy in politics. The next thing I wanted to mention is that you said that the left has devious means and methods for accomplishing its goals, and we see a lot of the people who are now in the walkaway movement. I just checked again this morning. There's now 175,000 people who have walked away from the Democratic Party and liberalism in the last 2 months, or since late May. And a lot of them, it's not policy disagreements so much as it is the way they get treated. If they even so much as ask a question of their friends jump right down their throats. And so they're getting tired of that kind of treatment and that kind of fascism from the left. And so they've decided to walk away. So there's that part of it also.
Chris, you absolutely nailed it. you know, on a personal level where I work, there is someone who feeds on CNN and MSNBC, and I've watched this person become filled with rage and hate, and they weren't always like that. And so I'm seeing, when I read Twitter, Facebook, I can tell right away what people are feeding on, what they're reading, what they're watching, what they're listening to, because they can't even converse civilly. If you don't agree with them, some of the garbage that pours out of them, it's frightening. It's starting to move to a point where it's becoming frightening. And as I like to put on my social media, who are the haters? Question mark, question mark. You know, I realize that you're not going to agree with anybody on everything, but if we can be civil and agree to disagree and go our own ways and keep the door open for conversations about things totally unrelated to politics. I have people like that in my life where we don't talk politics. That's just the way it is. But the way I'm seeing this going is starting to concern me, as far as the vitriol and the growing hate. Can you speak to that?
Well, I can. I agree with you completely. I mean, if they call us haters, but if they want to find haters, they should look in the mirror. Just some of the stuff that's coming out of the left these days, people knocking mega hats off of teenagers and all the rest of it. What happened to Sarah Huckabee Sanders in the restaurant in Virginia? There's all kinds of hate going on the left. If I could move now into some news, some recent news about the Constitution, what I'd like to do there is take up the question that you often hear from the left, and that is, well, why should we pay attention to the Constitution? The Constitution just isn't relevant. So I think that by the end of this little segment, you're going to see just how relevant the Constitution is. In the recent news, the question will not be how many people were affected. The question will be how many people were not affected. And here are some of the headlines from last week. Some of the headlines this past week affected anybody who's on Facebook. Constitutional question also arose for anyone who rides a city bus or a subway, anyone who owns a gun, anyone who has a smart meter, and anyone who votes absentee. Well, that's a lot of people. That's millions of people. So don't tell me the Constitution is irrelevant. So in just going over 5 quick news stories, in the Fourth Amendment case, there's a case under seal where the government is trying to force Facebook to break its encryption and allow wiretapping of its messenger service. So that's a Fourth Amendment question. That affects anybody who's, could potentially affect anybody who's on Facebook. On the First Amendment, a federal appeals court, there's still wrangling back and forth about this. It's Pamela Geller's ads on buses in Washington, D.C. And so what a federal appeals court did last week was said there's enough here to send it back to the trial court to determine whether or not there's a legitimate reason for the transit authority here in Washington to ban her ads from buses and in the Second Amendment. Louisiana, the state of Louisiana, barred Citigroup and Bank of America from taking part in a state bond sale because of actions those banks previously took against gun manufacturers. So that's that. Anybody who owns a gun is going to be affected by what is becoming to be called corporate gun control. And this is where the left is trying to convince their lefty friends in the big corporations to stop doing business with anybody, manufacturers or otherwise, who has anything to do with guns. And it's part of a broader effort by the left to shut the non-left out of vital services. So this week, Visa and MasterCard just backed down from denying service to David Horowitz's Freedom Center. That what they were doing, that threatened the center's ability to accept donations. If you can't do it on a credit card, how are you going to do it over the internet in this internet age? So this whole question is an up and coming area of constitutional law. I believe it's the question of discrimination in public accommodations. Another Fourth Amendment case, anybody who has a smart meter, there's a federal appeals court that just ruled that the information that flows to a public utility is a search. Now, the Fourth Amendment says unreasonable searches require a warrant. You have to have a warrant based on probable cause. Well, What the court did was it put it in the reasonable search envelope, not requiring a warrant. So anybody who has a smart meter, their data can flow to a public utility, get shared with the government. So there's a Fourth Amendment concern there. And the last story I'll mention is that a federal judge ruled that election officials can't toss absentee ballots out that fail to match their signature cards without giving voters notice and an opportunity to contest the action. So that's sort of a basic due process concern. Due process is in the 5th and 14th Amendments, but notice and opportunity to be heard, that's bread and butter due process jurisprudence. And so that's the news, and I hope it shows you just how many people are affected by constitutional questions each and every day. So when the left says the Constitution is irrelevant, they just don't follow the news.
Well, extremely well said, Chris, and your timing is perfect because we're just about out of time for today. Great information, great points. Thank you for bringing them to our attention. We look forward to resuming our conversation next week with you. And you may have a guest. We'll wait and find out and let our subscribers know what our topic will be about. So once again, thank you, Chris, for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Kim.
All right, take care.